I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from North Carolina, my good friend, Mr. Bishop.
Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Behold the nonpartisan nature of the January 6th committee. It puzzles me why it would have been so different had the allegedly bipartisan commission been approved. In fact, in the January 6th committee's markup on the contempt resolutions, the Grand Inquisitor said in opening, quote, "I can say confidently that for the many involved in the run-up to January 6th, an oath, a statement of fidelity to our democracy, was nothing more to them than meaningless words. I fear what happens if those people are again given the reins of power." This sums up the purpose of the January 6th Inquisition in a way that is both cogent and terrifying. What the January 6th committee lacks in bona fide legislative purpose, not patina of legislative purpose, but bona fide legislative purpose, it makes up for in pure political vendetta. This investigation isn't about truth or democracy. It's a pure political power play. The immediate target is President Trump, but the ultimate target is those people, namely the millions of Americans who voted for President Trump. Why is there no dissent from this objective on this committee? Well, because the only members nominally representative of the minority, chosen by the majority speaker over the objection of the minority, shares the political objectives of the Grand Inquisitor. Accordingly, Liz Cheney said during the January 6th markup of these contempt resolutions, quote, "Our committee will continue to litigate to obtain the testimony we need." What need? To inform what legislative purpose does the committee need to obtain the RNC's contributor data and information? To discover who opened its emails and clicked through to donation pages. On the other hand, it could serve her purpose to demonize her political opponents, especially those who donate to President Trump. Additional minute?
You want an additional 30?
Gentleman's recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
It is common for the zealot to lose the capacity for irony. Hence, Chairman Thompson says that laws prohibit doing politics on the clock. Quote, "It's important that taxpayer dollars don't support political activity," quote. And Ms. Cheney waives the Constitution even while she poses as the designee of the minority, imposed on the minority in an historically unprecedented trampling of the institutional norms. This is a kangaroo court, a court of the Star Chamber. They continue to trample the concepts and the institutional norms of the Congress, and I'm certain that the American people will have an answer for this very soon. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have no further speakers at this time, and I would yield myself the balance of my time. Reserve. Reserve.
Gentleman from Maryland.
But I will yield to Ms. Jackson-Lee for 30 seconds.
Gentlelady from Texas recognized for 30 seconds.
I thank the gentleman. The people of the United States deserve to know the truth. With all of the ranting of my friends across the aisle, the Constitution indicates that this nation was formed to create a more perfect union. There were those who incited January 6th. There were those who surrounded President Trump who did nothing to stop the violence and terrorism of January 6th. If witnesses come before a duly authorized bipartisan committee and refuse to provide the American people with the truth, then we need to stand here and provide them with a contempt order so that the truth can be found. I ask my colleagues to join me in voting for this contempt order for the truth for the American people and the sanctity of the Constitution. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Maryland reserves.
I reserve.
And the gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to check there's no further speakers that my friend from across the aisle has.
No further speakers.
Okay. Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I have no further speakers at this time, and I would yield myself the balance of our time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate it. I consider my friend across the aisle a friend, and it's certainly an honor and a privilege to debate law with him, given the fact that he's a renowned constitutional law expert. I mean that sincerely. It is fun being up here with you. So knowing that you have the last word, knowing that he has the last word, I do just have to cite one more case for my good friend. I just keep going back to Trump versus Thompson, 2022, where Justice Kavanaugh said there's only two very narrow exceptions to this privilege. Number one, which can be found in United States versus Nixon, relates to a pending criminal trial. There's no pending criminal trial here. That exception is not applicable. The second narrow exception is one found in Senate Select Committee versus Nixon. And there, it's whether the subpoenaed evidence is demonstrably critical to the responsible fulfillment of a committee's function. I'm quoting the precedent here. And that case law goes on to state there is clear difference between Congress's legislative tasks and the responsibility of a grand jury. Went on further to describe that Congress frequently legislates on the basis of conflicting information provided in its hearings all the time. So I would submit that that exception does not apply either. Reasonable minds can differ, but I'm very confident that the case law here supports the case of Mr. Scavino. But with that said, the law notwithstanding, it seems that my friends across the aisle have proven time and time again that they don't care about the separation of powers. They don't care that they don't care about the protection of our constitutional rights. They don't even care about the rules of the House. They only do if those items fit a political narrative. It's very clear to me that from the Select Committee's treatment of Mr. Scavino and from the resolution before us today, that they would rather prefer to keep up their political theater rather than conduct a legitimate congressional investigation. I urge my colleagues to vote no on the previous question and no on the rule. And with that, I yield back my time.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I do want to thank my friend from Pennsylvania. Sometimes when I hear him in committee, I think about another great Republican who served in the House of Representatives from Pennsylvania, Thaddeus Stevens. But today, you let me down a little bit because Thaddeus Stevens was a great enemy of insurrection and rebellion. And he led the forces in this Congress who insisted upon accountability for the people who would dare wage war against the Congress of the United States and against the Union and the people that were all elected to serve and to represent. Justice Kavanaugh, of course, was not ruling in the case that my good friend cited before. He was just opining. There was no ruling there, so that was one justice's opinion. My friend cuts me to the quick when he says, we don't care about the separation of powers. I think I'm going to have to turn that insult around and say they don't care about the separation of powers because the executive privilege the Supreme Court has repeatedly held, going all the way back to 1953 in a case called United States versus Reynolds, that the executive privilege may be invoked only by the President of the United States. And this President of the United States, who represents the Article II branch, has said he's not invoking it on behalf of Scavino or Navarro. He's rejected it. The funny part is that the former president they talk about hasn't even shown up to try to invoke it. And what they're talking about doing could never be the subject of executive privilege anyway, because it's political activity, which is a crime under the Hatch Act, and it's criminal activity. It's a crime to engage in insurrection and coup. How could executive privilege, even if you had a president who wanted nothing more than to try to drape the activities of Scavino and Navarro in executive privilege, how could that president ever prove that it applied when Navarro's job, for example, was the trade advisor? This has nothing to do with trade. He was engaged in trying to overthrow a presidential election, as Judge Carter said last week. Mr. Speaker, this is a matter of the utmost solemnity and seriousness to the American people. We're talking about the survival of American democratic government. For most of human history, people have lived under people like Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, the kings and the queens and the dictators and the tyrants and the bullies that some people would want to flatter. But we got something else going on in here in America. We've got a project in democratic self-government. Lincoln knew how tenuous it was. He asked whether government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall last or shall perish from the earth. That's the question facing us too. So, Let's deal with all the issues and controversies we want. But couldn't we get together and all stand up for the institutions of the country? We're doing that in our committee, which is bipartisan. I fear that sometimes we're moving into a Democratic-Republican caucus in Congress and a Trump caucus. There are those of us, like Ms. Cheney, like Mr. Kinzinger, like Mr. Thompson, on the committee who want to work together to get to the bottom of this and then to deal with the problems of the country. And there are those, like the minority leader, who will follow the will of Donald Trump if he says he doesn't want any investigation at all. And I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, but that's where we are today. These two witnesses have acted with contempt towards Congress and the American people. We must hold them in contempt of Congress and the American people. I yield back.